Very good. So welcome all, whoever is here for the important first presentation of the 2023-2024 webinar series on discrimination, integration, inclusion, all the topics that the Minorities in Economics Committee at the EA is pushing to do more research on, and we are happy to have the winner of the award that was given at the EA meetings in August, Ethan Kaplan, who will talk to us about both results and methodology on how to assess various types of discrimination related to race. Go ahead, Ethan.
All right, thank you very much, Massimo, for inviting me for the talk, and also thanks to the EEA for the award this summer. This is joint work with Jörg Spenkuch, who's at Northwestern, and Cody Tuttle, who's at the University of Maryland. So I just thought I would start with a brief overview of the history of race and education in the United States. So the United States had slavery until the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1865. Actually, a bunch of states, starting well before the United States existed in 1739 through 1834, a number of states actually banned African Americans from getting any education. They were banned from actually learning to read specifically. Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia. Then in 1896, there was a famous Supreme Court decision by the Supreme Court called Plessy v. Ferguson, which created the separate but equal doctrine in the US. And that said that it was okay to have Blacks and whites attend explicitly racially segregated schools as long as they were equal. Of course, they were highly unequal, and white students got 10, 20 times more in the way of resources than Black students did. So actually, in one of the fastest turnaround times for the reversal of a Supreme Court decision, that Plessy v. Ferguson decision got reversed in 1954 by the very famous Brown v. Board of Education decision, but which actually said that the separate but equal doctrine was incorrectly decided. But there was essentially no change after that decision for the next 10 years until the passage in 1964 of the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act gave the Department of Justice direct enforcement power. So it allowed the Department of Justice to go in and actively integrate schools rather than passively waiting for students to sue for the right to attend integrated schools. There also followed the 1964 Civil Rights Act a large number of civil lawsuits, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So here is the fraction of Black students in the South of the United States who attended schools that were majority white. Remember, even in the South, most states were majority white. After the passage, at the time of the passage of the Brown v. Board of Education decision, 0% of African Americans were in schools that were majority white. And that really didn't change until after 1964. And then between 1964 and the end of the decade, that percentage went up to 37%. It finally peaked in 1989. Shortly after that, there was a rolling back of the Supreme Court's view on the mandate to integrate schools. And schools are increasingly less integrated over time. So there's been a lot of prior work in economics on busing and its impact. So the first question that people have asked is, did busing lead to integration? So Gurion, Reber both looked and found that that one, busing did lead to integration, but two, it also led to the flight of white families out of those school districts. So sometimes they would put their kids in private schools. Sometimes they would actually leave the school district to go to a more white school district, but nonetheless, they did find that there was a significant increase, as you can see in this prior figure, in integration. There's been some work done looking at the impact of racial integration on educational attainment and educational quality. So Billings, Deming, and Rockoff in QJE 2014 used geographical discontinuities at school district boundaries when they redistrict. And, they look at what happens to people who used to be in the same district. Now they're in different districts, and one of them is in a more integrated district. If they're a minority, what happens to their educational performance, and they find overall positive impacts. There's also been some correlational evidence on some social impacts, such as the rates of interracial marriage. So there's been some recent work on the political impact of racial integration. Bergman in 2018 and JPE used randomized lottery design for minorities to come to majority white school districts in California. He estimated the impact on test scores, college attainment, voter registration, and voter turnout. He does not look at partisanship. He doesn't find any registration or voting effects. Relative to what he does, there's some differences. First of all, he doesn't estimate partisan impacts, as I said. Second, he only looks at the impact on minorities, whereas our focus will be on whites. And third, he only looks at voting in California. We're, in contrast, going to look at voting nationally. So the paper that's probably most related to this paper is a paper by Billings, Chin, and Hagag in 2021. This is an independent paper. They looked at the end of busing in Charlotte, North Carolina. They compared people across school district lines where the end of busing differentially changed racial integration. And they found no impact on registration or turnout, but really large positive impacts of integration on Democratic Party registration. So relative to this paper, we have a number of differences as well. There's obviously going to be some differences in the design. We think that our work is even more convincing. Second of all, they don't estimate impacts in ideology, whereas we're going to show that there's not only a shift in partisanship from busing, there also was a shift in ideology. Second of all, we're going to estimate impacts at the beginning of busing. They, by contrast, look at the impacts of ending busing. And our effects are actually really surprising, precisely because 98% of whites were opposed to the busing plan at the time. Third of all, we're actually going to look at a situation where we effectively control for peer effects. So they interpret their results as due to peers being integrated. And we're going to argue that our results are not due to that at all. And lastly, they only look at the impact on 3 states, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. We're going to look at, in contrast, the country. One really related paper. So the person who came up with this great identification strategy was a former student, Cody Tuttle, and he used it to look at the impact on Black wages. So he has a really nice paper where he uses census data, and he finds no impact for whites of busing, but finds about a $2,000 impact or $290 per year impact of being bused for African Americans. So we're going to borrow Cody's methods. We're going to do some extension, some nice randomization inference results. We're going to estimate the impact upon whites of being bused in Jefferson County, Kentucky, over a period of 45 years. And we're going to find no large or significant impact on voter registration, nothing on voter turnout. We're going to find large positive impacts on Democratic registration and negative ones on Republican registration. We're going to find also a decrease to pro-life contributions to pro-life groups and anti-gay marriage groups. We find no large or significant impact on neighborhood segregation. And I don't have these for you today, but very shortly we'll be updating the paper to include results on attitudes towards race and redistribution from a survey that we were able to do with money from the National Science Foundation and the I'm forgetting the name of the Russell Sage Foundation. Okay. So let me now turn to timing of the specific legal interventions by courts that led to the design that we're going to use to estimate the impact of busing on politics. So first, in 1968, there's a very famous case called Green versus New Kent. So after the Brown v. Board of Education decision said that segregation was illegal, that didn't mean that segregation was mandatory. And so what a lot of southern states did is a lot of school districts in southern states did is they created what are called choice plans. So they allowed whites to choose to go to black schools and blacks to choose to go to white schools. And unsurprisingly, nothing changed. So starting in 1968, they said, look, this is not sufficient. And so sometimes we actually mandate integration rather than just allowing for choice. In 1971, the court said that the courts could undo unintentional self-segregation. So if there was segregation just based on where people lived, they could still integrate school districts, even though that segregation was not intentionally for the purpose of educational segregation. And finally, in 1974, Milliken v. Bradley, the Supreme Court said that they could, and this is very important for our particular case, they could integrate across school district boundaries if the boundaries were drawn for the purposes of racial segregation, which was the case in what I'm about to tell you. So in Jefferson County, Kentucky, they had actually created two school systems. So there's a nearly all-white Jefferson County public school system, which excluded the city of Louisville, even though Louisville was in Jefferson County. Louisville, of course, was much more African-American. And so this school district was created separate from the rest of the county precisely to keep African-Americans out of the white suburban Jefferson County schools. So there were two independent lawsuits, Haycraft v. Board of Education, Newberry area versus Jefferson Board of Education, that in 1974 got combined. And in 1975, the court, in 1974, they made a decision that this segregation was illegal. In 1975, that got upheld under appeal. Summer of 1975, the busing plan was formulated, and in fall 1975, they began the integration of the two school districts and of the schools. So a few notes about Kentucky. So one, it was a slave state. It was one of four slave states to side with the Union in the Civil War. It's currently about 4.5 million people. It's a pretty rural state. It's one of the most rural states. It's 92% white. About 86% have graduated from college, 24% from high school, 24% college. And in 2020, it was had the eighth highest Republican vote share. So it's a pretty rural white Republican state. Okay. So here is a map of different parts of Jefferson County. And so what you see is down here in this dense area is Louisville. This is the rest of the county, and everything's coded by fraction white. And so you see in most of the county, it's more than 90% white, less than 10% black. There really weren't many other minorities in Kentucky at that time. But then in the cities, a lot of areas were almost 90 to 100% white. So things were very segregated, and the schools reflected that. So here is a picture from a school yearbook at the time before segregation, and here's a black school, fully segregated. So integration was forced, and it was at times a violent process. So here is some people being bused in Kentucky. Actually, one of the most conflictual busing integration programs was in Boston. I'll show you that in a minute. So here, this is also from Kentucky. So here you see a protest against the busing, and here you see lined up against the wall the Ku Klux Klan. Most white residents, overwhelming percentage of white residents, 98% were opposed to the plan. As I had said earlier, So it's actually surprising to have that kind of unanimity. I feel like these days you could ask, should Martians blow up the Earth? And in the United States, we would get 15% saying yes. So 98% is a pretty high support rate. So,
now, of course, these were the parents or the people of the neighborhood, not directly the kids protesting, suppose.
it could have been either.
Okay, could be. Okay.
Yeah, parents were definitely heavily involved, but non-parents could also be, come to these protests.
Okay.
And see, they're protesting at the Jefferson Board of Education. So one of the things that's interesting about our particular design is that it was actually a two-way busing program. So whites were bused to black schools and blacks were bused to white schools with the object in mind that they would fully integrate all schools. In the white schools, they would be fully integrated by having an inflow of African Americans, and in the black schools by having an inflow of whites. So we actually think that that's why we think that peer effects is probably not what we're picking up, which is different from some of the prior literature. So African Americans were bused either 8 or 9 years. Whites were bused 2 or 1 years. The reason that whites were bused so much less than blacks is because they were trying to equalize the flows. And there were about 4 times as many whites as African Americans. So whites had to be bused 4 times less often. The plan that they came up with was a plan that was based upon the first letter of your last name. So depending upon what the first letter of your last name was, you would get allocated to be bused at, in different grades. So what's really key to our empirical strategy is that this alphabet plan was decided by the judge jointly with the 2 school boards after they unified into one in the summer of 1975. We're going to look at people who were in high school in the fall of 1974, well before the specifics of this alphabet plan, which we're going to use for identification purposes, was formulated. So here is a summary of the plan. If the first letter of your last name began with A, B, F, or Q, you were slotted to be, and you were white, you were slotted to be bused in 11th or 12th grade. If D, E, N, W, or Z, you were slotted to be bused in 5th or 10th. G, H, or L to 2nd and 7th. And here's this for blacks. We are only going to focus on whites, largely because we don't have enough power to look at African Americans. So this leads to a few sources of variation. So there's a difference in intensive margin of busing. So whites with last names beginning with I, J, K, and S are bused in 1 year, whereas everyone else is bused for 2 years. But we're actually not going to use this variation at all because we're going to look at people who were at least in middle school, and for a lot of specifications, only in high school. So we're not going to use the variation coming from the 1 versus 2 years using this group. A second source of our variation is that for white 10th graders in 1974, 1975, whose names began with A, B, F, or Q, they got 2 years of busing. Everyone else in that cohort got 0 years of busing. So we're going to look at people in the cohort before versus the cohort, versus that cohort. And the A, B, F, and Q last name people are going to have 2 years of busing relative to the year before that got 0. Whereas all the other alphabet groups we're still going to get 0 years of busing. So the 9th graders in 1974 with A, B, F, or Q are going to get 2 years of busing. And also D, E, N, W, and Z are going to get 1 year of busing. So here's a visualization of that. So in fall of 1974, no one got bused because the busing plan didn't start till the fall of 1975. So if you graduated in the fall of 1974, you got 0 years of busing. For the fall, people graduating in the fall of 1975, there was a 1 year stay. So seniors were not forced to be bused in their last year. So there was no busing for that graduating cohort. Starting in 1976, the A, B, F, and Q group got 2 years of busing. Also in 1977, but none of the other, the 1976 cohort, no other group did. And then also the D, E, N, W, and Z group got 1 year of busing. So that's the variation that we're mainly going to use. We have also done it using some of the variation coming from middle school. So in some cases, we have combined middle schools and high schools. And so when we use the variation coming from middle school as well, we actually get very similar results and we get more statistical power, but at the cost of creating an unbalanced panel since we don't have middle school information for all schools. So here's a basic explanation of our identification strategy coming from the main newspaper at the time, the Courier Journal. Some children in July of 1975, some children now in school, by the luck of the draw, won't be bused, even though they attend schools affected by the busing plan. For example, a white 9th grader who falls into a group that is to be bused in the 3rd and 8th grades will not be bused under this plan. And that is the basis for our identification strategy. So we're going to use data from Aristotle, which is a national, they're a private organization that collects voter registration data, and they provide it to political campaigns and special interest groups. They also, on the cheap, provide it to academics. Luckily, my co-author Jorg is from Northwestern Kellogg School of Business, so he's pretty wealthy. He was able to afford this, for the entire country. So it also contains the universe of registered voters as of 2018, except for Alaska and Hawaii. We are going to take from this the first name, the last name, the exact date of birth, sex, party registration, voting history, and predicted ideology, where the predicted ideology is based upon some unspecified machine learning algorithm that they refuse to tell us about. So a political party is not available for all states. It is available for only for closed primary states. So in the US, in a bunch of states, you have to register for a party in order to vote in that party's primary. And that's how we know that you're a member of that party. But there are only 18 states that require that. There's a bunch of other states which are open primary states where you don't have to register for a party. You can just show up and vote in another party's primary. So for those states, we think that sometimes in some of those states you can register for a party. In other states, there is no party registration period. So we're gonna, in our main analysis, restrict ourselves to these states where we have very good measures of partisan alignment. We have also imputed partisan alignment from looking at what primary. So if you vote in the Republican primary, we're going to say most recently, we're going to say you're a Republican. If you voted most recently in a Democratic Party, we say that you're a Democrat. When we do that, we find similar results. So what we did is we scanned yearbooks from the fall of 1974. We also did some from 1976 for validation purposes to look at graduation. To look at continuation in the school system and attrition. But we're going to use the fall of 1974 yearbooks, and we're going to collect, we had undergraduate coders type in the names, the first name, last name, sex, grade in school, and school name. And we also asked them to code in race based upon the photo, which was pretty evident. We have to match yearbook data to the voter registration data. So we take your yearbook, we take your last name and your first name, and we match it to the voter registration data to get political party and turnout. We're going to restrict our analysis to men. We would love to look at women, but unfortunately, most women at this time, when they got married, changed their names, and so they're very hard to track. So Aristotle would not actually give us their underlying data with the names in it. So we had to provide the entire voter registration. So we had to provide the entire school yearbook data to them. They did the matching for us. What they did was they started with 8,900 white men from the digitized high school yearbooks. They used name and approximate year of birth. The reason is approximate. They allowed for a 1-year tolerance because, if I'm born in November, then maybe I'll go the following year. But if I were born in June, I would go this year. Because of that, they have a 1-year tolerance in the year of birth. And using that, they find at least one match for 70% of the sample. They then filtered down to unique matches using Kentucky birth records. If Aristotle only yields one unique match, we kept it. If Aristotle had multiple matches, then we would take the person born in Kentucky. If there were more than one person born in Kentucky, we would take a person born in Jefferson County. And if that was not unique, we dropped them from the sample. In the end, we ended up with a sample of 52.7% had a unique match after that procedure. And so our main regression equation, we're going to look at our outcome. We're going to regress our outcome, the partisanship variable, on whether you're robust. We're going to put in alphabet group fixed effects, and then cohort group fixed effects. So what we're really going to be identifying off of, our main coefficient of interest is going to be beta, the coefficient on whether you're robust or not. And we're going to usurp the differential change in busing for the groups like A, B, F, and Q, the alphabet groups that differentially got bussed, later on in the sample relative to earlier in the sample, and we're going to compare them, the changes for those groups relative to other alphabet groups that did not experience a change in busing. For our standard errors, we're going to cluster at pre-busing school across cohort level, which gives us 48 clusters. The number of clusters is small. So we're also going to show a randomization inference design. So we think that the way that they chose to group the letters together was not random. A might have been put together with B, F, and Q for a reason that had to do with population balance or whatever. We also think that the assignment of alphabet groups to treatment years might not be random. But we do think that the way that alphabet groups get assigned to which years they were treated in. So in other words, why is it that A, B, F, and Q got 11 and 12 as opposed to 2 and 7? We think that is random. And so we're going to reassign alphabet groups to treatment years. So there are 6 alphabet groups, and therefore 6 different constellation of treatment years. So that means there are 720 different ways of assigning treatment to alphabet groups, but not all of them lead to differences in actual busing. So it turns out that if we use the full yearbook data, which would be 15 out of 19 schools, then including the junior high schools, then we would get 360 different permutations. If we only use variation coming from high school, then there would be 30 permutations. So how is that? Let's go back to our thing here. So basically, the point is that there are 6 ways to assign someone to the group that gets 2 years of 2 cohorts getting bussed. And there's 1 way conditional on that to assign these alphabet groups to the group that gets 1 year of busing. So that's 6 ways of doing this, 5 times 5 ways of doing that, that's 30. And so that's how we get 30 groups. All right. So let me quickly just show you some that we have 5,018 people. 13% of them were bussed. 49% of them live in Kentucky currently, or at least as of our most recent merge. 73% of them, so the vast majority, live in a closed primary state. And that roughly is because half of them still live in Kentucky, and then about half of the states are half of the population lives in a closed primary state. They're a little bit more Republican than Democrat, which is actually not true nationally and reflects the fact that Kentucky is a pretty Republican state. The largest group are actually independents. And they vote at around 60 to 70%, 60 to 80%, sorry. They have about a 60 to 80% turnout rate. So they have a pretty high turnout rate for the United States, but that reflects the fact that they're older and older people vote more. Finally, we're also going to look at donations to advocacy groups, so pro-life anti-same-sex marriage, anti-Affordable Care Act, that's the Obamacare bill, and pro-gun control. So these are things that we measure in the data. And on average, they're giving about 1% of the time, which is roughly similar to contribution patterns that you see for other groups. Okay, so here I'm showing you a non-parametric plot that shows you the fraction of Black students across schools. And so what you see, this is after integration. So if you had looked, so this is in red, we have the former city schools, and in gray, we had the former county schools. And if you had looked at, yeah, go ahead. All right. If you had looked at this before busing, these would have not even intersected. And you would have had the former county schools would have been out here like at 90 to 100% white, and most of the Black schools would have been down here at 0%. Most of the county schools would have been 0 to 10% Black, and most of the city schools would have been 90 to 100% Black. But what you can see is that it's still the case that the former city schools are a little bit more Black, but not much. So here are our first estimates. So this is on the impact of turnout. And so what we see is very small and statistically insignificant estimates. So we don't find that voting in general, voting in presidential elections, or voting in midterm elections are affected by whether you got bused. And these are off of elections ranging from the one in 2008 to 2018. Our data, by the way, begins in 2008. So, or has voting history back to 2000. So here are our main estimates. So we find almost a 6 percentage point reduction in being bused if we look at all states, where the way that we compute whether you're Republican or not is by looking at whether you participated in a Republican primary in your last primary that you participated in the open primary states. The closed primary states, we always take what your party of registration is. If we restrict to the affiliated states, to the ones that where to the closed primary states, we have a very similar result. So we do find a larger effect for closed primary states for on the effect of being Democrat, but in both cases we find very large effects. And so think about this: you were bused for random reasons, and other people weren't. 45 years ago, and today you're 4 to 7% more likely to be Republican and less likely to be Democrat. We don't find a significant impact on not being registered for a party or being independent. And that could reflect that busing shifted Republicans and made them Democrats, or that it shifted Republicans and made them independents, and then shifted a roughly equal amount of independents and made them Democrats. We can't disentangle between those two. So we estimate, as I said, for a number of different measures of ideology, and we find that you're statistically significantly less likely to donate to pro-life causes. You're less likely to contribute against marriage equality, but you're not really likely to change your contribution patterns for the Affordable Care Act. Now, if you look at these numbers look really small, so they're 0.5 percentage points, but remember the mean, but they're still statistically significant. And that's because the mean contribution rate, if you remember, was slightly more than 1%. So this is actually about a 50% effect at the mean relative to the mean. That's a huge impact. Overall, we find that if you're bused, you're about 0.7 percentage more less likely to support conservative causes. We don't find a positive impact, a statistically significant positive impact on liberal causes. So now let me briefly go through the randomization inference. So if you remember, our standard errors are clustered at the school cross cohort level. this is a small number of clusters for asymptotic inference. So it's probably better to cluster at the school level rather than the school cross cohort level, but there's really too few clusters to cluster at the school level. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use randomization inference, and this has a few nice properties. So the main thing it allows us to not rely on asymptotics, but rather to use the small sample distribution. And second of all, it allows us to use the non-parametric distribution for testing, as I will show you in a minute. So we're going to plot the 30 alternative randomizations that could have occurred. So that's the 30 different ways. Whoops. The 30 different ways that we could have assigned these alphabet groups to times of being bust that would have generated differences on whether or not these cohorts got bust. That's what we're going to use. So when we do that, it turns out that the effect on Republican registration is the lowest out of all the 30 possible permutations, and the effect for Democratic is the highest out of all 30 permutations. So we also do this including the middle school data, and there we find that the impact for Republicans is the second most negative out of 360. And for Democrats, we find it's the largest out of 360. So these p-values, since they're based off of 30 permutations, the p-value here is 3% for each, for both Democrats and Republicans. If we did the 360 variant, we would find our p-values to be about 0.3% for Democrats and about 0.6% for Republicans. So very, very statistically significant. So one thing that you might be concerned with is that a bunch of people left the school district. And so we have some evidence that this actually happened. So where did they go? So a bunch of them moved. Some of them went to segregation academies. Believe it or not, there were KKK schools, and they also went to Catholic schools. In terms of internal validity, this could be a problem for us because they left the school district. However, we're not measuring whether they were treated or not. We're measuring an intention to treat effect because we're measuring whether they were present in the school system a year and a half before, in fall of 1974, a year before they knew the specifics of this busing plan. So there's no way that that people across these different alphabet groups differentially knew that they were going to be bused and therefore that they should leave the school system. So we don't think that our sample is subject to internal validity criticisms. However, there is an external validity criticism. Some of our people went to these other schools. So if we think that there's an average treatment effect, beta average treatment effect, and there's also an effect of going to one of these KKK segregation academy or Catholic schools, then our intention to treat effect that we're estimating is a convex mixture of these two parameters, the effect of going to public school and being bused, plus the effect of going to a private school and not being bused. To the degree that we think that going to a segregation academy is not going to make you more progressive and more liberal, then our ITT estimates are a lower bound on our average treatment effect. To the degree that you think that that's not the case, then you can at least interpret our ITT estimates as an intention to treat effect. So actually, in the interest of time, we have 3 minutes left. I'm going to skip over this. We do look at whether or not you differentially left the system by looking at the 1976 yearbooks and matching. And we find that you are 14% more likely to have left the system or to not match in 1976 if you were slotted to be bused because of the first letter in your last name. So we run the same specification, but on the left-hand side, instead of putting Republican or Democratic registration, we put whether you're still there in 1976, and we get a 14.3% effect. And so from that, we think that actually the average treatment effects that I showed you, which are really large and over 45 years, are likely even larger than the intention to treat effects that we estimate. So really quickly, let me just say something about mechanisms. So we find large impacts of busing on partisanship. The impact is over 45 years. Integration, there's two-way integration. We don't think that the integration of students is really what's causing our effects, because we think that because they were relatively equally apportioned at all schools. All schools were roughly equally integrated. Resources were also relatively equalized across schools, so we don't think that's a mechanism. So what are the remaining mechanisms? One is the race of the teacher. So the race of the teacher in the city schools that the whites were getting bused to was heavily African-American. There were almost no African-American teachers in the white county schools. And that could have two impacts. One is that you could have preconceived notions about African-Americans, and those could change from experiencing an African-American teacher. The other is that they might have a very different version of history, and that being taught that different version of history may change your political attitudes. Another possibility is that the areas they were being bused into was much more poor. And so maybe that had an impact. And also they were much more racially diverse, the neighborhoods that they were being bused into. So maybe exposure to that actually had an impact. So as I said, following the 1964 Civil Rights Act, segregation of education decreased dramatically, and it's since then increased. There's been a rise and decline of busing, a movement to the suburbs, and that's reintroduced integration. And this is even though private primary and secondary schools are actually on the decline, there's an increase in segregation. There's also been a recent rise in racial politics and in hate crimes. So, in future research, it would be interesting to look at whether this is connected to resegregation. Let me just talk to you before I conclude about what we are finishing up. We should have a new paper in just a couple of weeks. And then we're finally going to submit it. We have a longer yearbook time series going back to 1970. This is already done, and we find very similar results from adding in these extra control groups of people who didn't get bused. We obtained high schools that were exempt. Remember, we only used 15 of 19 high schools. That's because 4 of them already qualified for having sufficient racial mixing. These are all city schools that had a mixture of whites and blacks and a sufficiently high amount that they weren't subject to the busing plan. We estimate impacts on them, and we don't find anything, which is very reassuring. We also check graduation rates using a graduation list using an IV, and we've collected those graduation so that we can look at the impact of graduating and participating in the busing plan rather than just an ITT effect. We also got money, as I said, from Russell Sage Foundation and National Science Foundation, and we surveyed around 600 people who were in the school system at the time. Some got bused, some didn't, on their attitudes today on race, on their partisanship, on their attitudes towards inequality and redistribution, on attitudes towards trust in government, and also on who they voted for in the last couple of elections. And so we will have those results very shortly as well. So let me summarize. So we find long-run estimated effects of busing on politics over 45 years later, really large, long-run effects. These are about an order of magnitude larger than estimates that I have come up with on the impact of Fox News, for example, on voting patterns. We find that busing had little to no impact upon white registration and turnout. But we find that busing increased registration as a Democrat by 6.5 to 7.5 percentage points and decreased Republican registration by about 5.5 percentage points. We find no impact on ACA-related contributions, but we do see that it actually affected contributions to other progressive causes that are not related to race, and that might reflect that this busing experience caused a more general shift, not only in partisanship, but in ideology. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ethan. This is very impressive, especially the dimension of the results. So while people think about what they want to ask, so there is 15 minutes, so there are a few minutes for questions. Let me ask one. So the mechanisms, right? So you mentioned at the beginning that that you don't think it is peer effects, you know, and then you mentioned at the end that one of the mechanisms could be the contact with African American teachers. So can you explain me again why couldn't it be, you know, peer effect in terms of, you know, even playing or studying with kids of different race?
Right. So so if you go back, so let me tell you why I don't think it is, and then let me tell you one potential mechanism where it could be, but I don't think that this is the case, but it is something that we're currently trying to look into. So what you see here is a histogram of the fraction of Black schools in the former city schools, which were recipients of whites, and then the home schools for the whites out in the county. And so what you see here is, you know, in red you see the you see the former city schools, and in gray you see the former county schools. And the thing that's impressive about this figure is that the fraction of schools where, you know, which are 20% Black is not that different between the formerly white schools and the formerly Black schools. So in other words, if I got bused, you know, maybe I'd have 22% of the school being Black, but if I stayed in my home school, I'd have maybe 20% being Black. So there were small differences in the fraction Black after the busing integration program because whites were bused to Black schools and Blacks were bused to white schools. Since it was a two-way busing, the fraction Black was equalized across schools, and therefore there wasn't a difference in the composition, the racial composition of schools for those who got bused compared to those who didn't.
I see.
So the reason that it could still be peer effects is it's possible that the white schools had things like magnet programs or ways to segregate white students into special classrooms where their peers in the classrooms, even though the schools were integrated, the classes weren't. So tracking. The reason I don't think it is this, but we're still trying to get information on this, is that tracking doesn't actually emerge until later than this. So tracking actually is a reaction to this type of integration. And this is a little bit too early for tracking to really have been introduced, even in these former county schools.
Right. And in terms of the contact with teachers, it could be, as you said, the reading of history, but it could also be that, you know, by in any case, having again contact with an African American teacher, even regardless of the content of the reading of the books, could reduce the racism attitudes. And then as much as one could use the statistical evidence on Democrats being less racist, so the mechanism could be one that goes through racist attitudes.
Yeah. So. That's absolutely correct. So we you know, there were some pretty racist attitudes that were prevalent at that time. So, you know, there were, you know, beliefs about differential intelligence across races. And so it's possible that white students had been told myths about differential intelligence by race, and then experienced really smart African-American teachers, and that changed their minds. And we actually, one of the things that we survey actually two types of racism questions. And so we have two types of racism indexes that we compute using the survey. So one of them are old-fashioned racism questions, like, would you feel comfortable if your son or daughter married someone who was Black? So this isn't a question that has been used on a bunch of different surveys to you know, ask old-fashioned type racism questions. So there's not tons of people who will answer yes to this. Nonetheless, there's enough And we do actually pick up in effect on that. We also ask some more subtle racism questions as well, but we find impacts on both, that there's a reduction in both measures of racism.
Very good. Other questions from the audience?
I think the audience is largely you, Umberto, and then the University of Maryland. So
yeah, so let's then thank you for giving this webinar, which hopefully will be followed then from the recording later on. We can stop, Umberto, if you can stop the recording, and then we will adjust it, of course, to cut out this last discussion, this last part. Umberto, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
I'm going to stop.
Okay. So you are good. Okay.
Yeah.
Because you are still in time here too. Okay. Very good.
Thank you. I cannot stop the recording.
Okay. Very good. So Ethan.